what is actually happening when a leader says the word accountability.
Honestly, like they're naming a feeling, which is usually disappointment because they're doing it at the wrong time. Somebody said they would do something and they didn't, and accountability is the word that sounds serious without requiring whoever's speaking that word to do anything about the system that produced the miss.
Hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast, where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today I am joined by my co-host, Scott Morris. He's a former CHRO with all of the scar tissue to prove it. He's the alleged founder of the world's only accountability task force that was never actually held accountable for any of its results, and the founder of Propulsion AI. Now, Scott, here is the one that I keep tripping over. Leaders say they have an accountability problem the same way they say they have a weather problem, loudly, repeatedly, and without any plan to change the climate. Most organizations have been chasing accountability for years, and the culture is no more reliable than when they started. Now, I'm going to say I've been in C-suite meetings where someone drops the accountability word, and I can literally feel myself cringe, not because the frustration behind it isn't real, it totally is, but because the word lands as a threat every single time. It points at people. It does not point at conditions, and the room knows it, even if nobody says it.
It's one of my least favorite words. I love the underlying concept. I hate this word more than a lot of them. But before we dive in, do us a favor, folks, subscribe to the podcast. Or leave us a comment or drop us a quick review on your preferred platform. It's how we grow the pod. It's how we keep it sharp for senior leaders.
Okay, let's dive in. Every CHRO has heard this one. We need to build a culture of accountability. Shows up on engagement surveys, on value slides, and post-mortems after a bad quarter. And it's not exactly wrong. The instinct behind it is real. Leaders want people to own their work and to follow through on their commitments. But Scott, I want to start with something that you and I talked about last week, because I think you named it better than I had. What is actually happening when a leader says the word accountability?
Honestly, like they're naming a feeling, which is usually disappointment because they're doing it at the wrong time. Somebody said they would do something and they didn't, and accountability is the word that sounds serious without requiring whoever's speaking that word to do anything about the system that produced the miss.
Right, and that's the trap, because accountability is almost entirely backwards looking. It points at the person. It asks who owns the failure literally after it's already occurred.
And, I've seen this run hot in a lot of organizations that I've worked in. The leadership team declares accountability as a cultural priority, which is my other issue, connecting it to one of those vague words or words that we use to mean everything like culture. A new framework goes in, a dashboard maybe, a weekly check-in, and 6 months later, the same misses are happening, but now the team is also exhausted from the overhead.
And Gallup's most recent State of the Global Workforce data puts global employee engagement at 23%. We've shared that number before. And it's barely moved in a decade. It's actually gone down, despite an enormous investment in culture and accountability programs. So something's not connecting. What is it?
Jackson, what I think is not connecting is that we keep treating accountability as a declaration and expecting it to produce a different behavior. We're not addressing the system underneath. And here's what I think gets missed. The organizations who do what they say they do reliably, over time, they don't talk about accountability that much. They talk about commitments. They talk about whether they did what they said. The cultural norm is different.
I think you hit it. I think that's the word, reliability. And it behaves completely different from accountability in an organization. Accountability is, generally speaking, what you reach for after something breaks. Reliability is what you build so that fewer things break in the first place.
And when you frame it that way, the CHRO's job changes around that. You're not running a recovery operation. You're designing the conditions for success.
It sounds great until you ask what those conditions actually are, Scott. And that's where I think most organizations end up, they don't go all the way. They stop. They like the framing, but they don't know what to build. It's kind of like what we talked about empowerment last time.
And which, for the record, and it's why I hate the word, is how most cultural initiatives end up. They end up like a poster. They're less interested in the architecture.
I think we're both guilty of that. I've actually commissioned the poster.
I've approved the vendor who made the poster.
So yeah, you win. Let's go out a few faulty assumptions that they get leaders stuck. Sorry, that really made me chuckle. That was a good one. So here's the first faulty assumption. We have an accountability problem. No one actually says we have a clarity problem, but that's almost always what really is happening. The expectation lived in the leader's head, and it never made it out to the balance of the team. So the assumption is that the team understood exactly what they were committed to, and with what resources, by when, and to what standard, and they chose not to do it anyway. But in reality, like this may be wrong, but I think in most organizational misses, the commitment was never actually explicit enough to honor. And you can't hold people accountable for expectations that were never made specifically. So when you try, what happens is you end up producing defensiveness, not performance. And then people optimize for managing blame rather than delivering outcomes. That's not what that actually works against what you were initially going into by saying accountability to begin with.
Here's another one that I think a lot of us have heard. We just need people to own it. And that's said as if ownership is some kind of character trait that some people have and others develop. But ownership is an environment. And that's why I hate the term, I'm going to hold you accountable, because you can't do it. The faulty assumption here is that telling, people that they own something actually transfers authority to them, and that people who don't own it are somehow choosing not to. And that's an absolutely bad assumption. The reality is that most people who look like they're not owning the work, they're actually waiting to be overridden. They've learned from experience that ownership is provisional. And once that pattern exists, then asking somebody to own something is like asking them to take on a risk without any authority. That's not ownership, it's exposure.
This one's going out to all the CHROs out there. I feel a little bit like Casey Kasem, but I think we've all heard this at some stages of our career, probably multiple times during the career. We need stronger accountability systems. And then every time that gets said, a dashboard magically appears, and then another dashboard, and then a dashboard to track the dashboards. But the ultimate problem is believed to be some form of visibility challenge. Like no one knows who owns what. That if the leaders could just see the commitments more clearly, they could reinforce them more consistently. We need a PMO office to make sure we have everything written down, but that's nonsense. In reality, I think most organizations don't have an information problem. They don't have a tracking problem. They actually have a conversational problem. Accountability infrastructure tells you what happened. It doesn't change what people do when something is going sideways, and that's where you need to focus.
And we use this word like synonymously with consequences. I'm going to hold you accountable means I'm just going to impose consequences. Ridiculous. In a high trust culture, our people are going to hold each other accountable. That's one I've heard for certain. And that one sounds, more sophisticated. And I actually think it causes more damage. The nicest organizations are often the least reliable. And it's not that consequences don't belong. It's just that the system that delivers clarity rules. The assumption here that's faulty is that trust and accountability somehow reinforce each other. And then if people genuinely care about one another and about the mission of the organization, that they will name broken commitments directly. But the reality is that kindness without rigor produces social comfort and operational drift. Nobody is the bad guy. Right? And nothing gets fixed. And the miss becomes the new normal. And reliability requires somebody to say, you said you would do this and you didn't. And that person understood what it was that they were supposed to deliver on. In a high kindness culture, that sentence kind of disappears. So that last one, Jackson, is the one that I keep coming back to, because I've been in rooms like you have where everyone liked each other and everyone trusted each other and they genuinely wanted the organization to succeed. And they were completely unable to because no one would name the thing that needed naming.
Yeah, it's interesting because we talk a lot about psychological safety, and I think you just really hit on this really, really well, because psychological safety, as I define it, is the ability to put a very uncomfortable truth on the table and still feel like you belong to the team. What's one of the most important psychological kind of truths you can put on the table? That you didn't live up to the commitment that you made. I think there's something really there, because the thing, as I think about accountability as a cultural target, it sounds like it has rigor, and it really doesn't. It's about blame. And reliability, I think, is about something completely different. It's about whether the system is designed to keep those commitments, and designing that system requires a completely different set of questions entirely.
I think that's 100% right. And so just to be 100 and painfully percent clear with everybody, we're not saying consequences are bad, and we're not saying we don't want people to deliver. We're just saying we're going about it wrong. So let's reframe this thing, Jackson. How do we move from accountability as a cultural aspiration to reliability as a system? And I think you landed on a framework for this that I think we should walk through. 3 conditions, and you and I refer to it as the reliability architecture. And the premise here is, if all 3 aren't in place, then the word accountable is trying to do work that it can't actually do.
Yeah, I want to flag something before we get too far into it. And this is not a feel-good reframe. Like, these 3 conditions require a manager to do real work, and probably work that they've been avoiding. Like, do it up front before the commitment is made. This is not soft. This is actually harder work.
And, it's not complex either, though. I think that's fair to mention, right? It is difficult, but the concepts are straightforward. The empowerment parallel is exactly the same. We did an episode on empowerment, right? The same prep work that makes people feel that the empowerment is real, it's the same work that makes reliability possible. You can't skip it and then be surprised where the system doesn't hold. Now, the first condition is commitment clarity. Before any significant commitment is made in your organization, 3 things need to be explicit. What done looks like, specifically and measurably, who owns it, by name, not by function, and what resources and dependency that person needs in order to actually deliver it. Most organizations do one of those, at least in my experience, do one of those, but not all 3 of them. They name the owner, but they rarely name done, or what done looks like, with specificity. And they almost never name the dependencies.
And I think that dependency piece is where so much of the downstream failure starts. Because someone commits to delivering something by a date, and no one actually figures out that the delivery requires 3 other functions to do something first. And they have their own jobs to do. And 2 of those functions have like way more competing priorities, and never actually had the conversation. So the deadline arrives, the commitment misses, and the person named as the owner gets the accountability conversation. But they weren't actually the constraint.
How do you get your leadership team to actually do the work? Because I've seen it resisted in every organizational context that I've worked in. It feels bureaucratic. It slows things down. How do you get them to do the work?
Yeah, look, I've tried a whole bunch of different things, and the only thing that works from my experience is making a norm before something breaks, not a tool that you introduce afterwards. So if you introduce commitment clarity after failure, it feels very punitive. If you do it up front, it feels like it's due diligence. So the timing of those things, I think, is everything. So let's move on to the second one. And I think the second condition is what I think of as kind of early flagging norm. And it's probably not the right way to phrase it, but in any accountability culture, flagging early feels like you admitted defeat. And so you made the commitment, and then you flagged it before the deadline means you're no longer owning it. So people tend to keep their head down, and they keep trying right up until the deadline, at which point the miss is a crisis.
And the late disclosure, the cost of that is pretty big. A risk that is named 6 weeks before a deadline is a problem with options. But the same risk named the day before the deadline is a crisis, and you just don't have any.
Yeah. So the cultural shift is flagging early is what reliable people do. It's not a sign of failure. It's a sign of reliability. The person who says this commitment is at risk, here is why, and here's what I need to protect it, that person is actually being more reliable than the person who stays quiet, and then misses the deadline clean.
And it requires the manager to not react to somebody flagging the way that most managers tend to react to the flag, which is with visible disappointment or by jumping in to fix it or by immediately reassigning the work. All of those reactions teach people not to bring risks to the table early.
Yeah, that made me laugh only because I've lived through it. But I want to double down on what you just said. The manager's behavior in response to an early flag is literally as important as the norm itself. If you protect the person who flags, you're going to get more flagging. If you punish them, even subtly, because they're going to be looking for it to be punishing, given the way most companies work over the last 50 years, you're going to end up getting silence up until the deadline. So you have to decide what is more important to you. Get it while you still have time to fix it, or do it at the very last minute where you're kind of stuck.
But what's interesting is that flagging is accountability. It's them saying, this is important to me. I own this. I want to raise this as a risk. And you know what? Like, lest anybody thinks that we're criticizing them, I certainly have been the manager who reacted badly to a flag. I didn't think I was doing it at the time, but the person read my face and I watched them as they stopped raising the things that were problematic. And I didn't connect those two things until much later.
Yeah, I unfortunately have a bulbous head that when I get frustrated with something, it turns beet red.
I've seen it.
That's actually not really helpful because I can say all the things. I can have my 68, beats per minute heart rate, but my head turns red, and then people stop talking, and I'm like, no, I'm having a stroke or something. So, like, we're not standing outside the patterns. I guess what we're trying to say. We ended up. At least I've built the pattern, but it takes, first step is to admit you have a problem. And I think both of us did that.
Let me push us on to the third condition, which is response by design and not by blame. That third condition is the one that changes what happens after something goes wrong. In an accountability culture, when a commitment breaks down, the first question is usually who owned this? And that question is useful, but in most organizations, it's the only question, which means that the learning stops at the person.
Yeah, the reliability question, I think, is different. It's what about the way this commitment was made produced a fragile outcome? Were the dependencies named? Was there a flag that didn't get heard in time? So the question points at the design rather than the person. And the answer to that question is where you find the actual lever that caused the problem.
And I think this is where we as CHROs can have an enormous structural influence, because the post-mortem is a CHRO moment, right? Who facilitates it and what questions get asked and what the organization learns from it. That's a design choice. A CHRO who consistently introduces the design question alongside the ownership question is gradually shifting the culture's model of what went wrong.
Yeah, there is a risk here, and that it might feel like you're letting people off the hook. But here's what I found: the people who are genuinely responsible take more ownership, not less, when that question is design oriented, because they're not as defensive. Like, they can think clearly about what actually happened. That's what you're going for.
The design question produces learning. The blame question produces protection.
Yeah, look. So the real question for CHROs is: are you willing to introduce that question at your own leadership table? Because I got bad news. It's going to feel uncomfortable the first time, probably the second time, probably the 10th time. Because you're asking your peers to examine the system that they literally built themselves. And that's a different kind of conversation than the ones that most post-mortems end up producing. So let's shift now and talk a little bit about how a CHRO can start this week. So I think play number one is run the commitment clarity diagnostic on one active initiative. So the way I would do it is pick an initiative that's currently in flight in your organization that's at risk, or maybe it's already risked, and then write down what done was supposed to look like, who was named as the owner, and what dependencies were required. And then ask the owner to do the same exercise independently. And then compare the two documents. The gaps are where the reliability failure lives. It's not in the person, it's a design, and that play will allow you to see it more clearly.
What I like about that is where that moves you from thinking about accountability as consequences to thinking about how you set the situation up so that people can be reliable. Here's another way you can do it. Change one post-mortem question. If you're running a post-mortem on something, in your next one, after a miss, add one question that might not be on your standard agenda. What about the way that this commitment was made it fragile? You don't have to replace the ownership conversation. You can run it alongside, but introduce the design question and watch what happens in the room. You'll see people stop defending and start analyzing.
And play number 3 is name the next early flag publicly. So the next time someone on your team flags a risk before a deadline, name it out loud in a room that matters, and then reinforce it. Like, this is exactly what we want. This is what reliability looks like. Flagging it early gave us options. Thank you. When you do it, that one moment does more for the early flagging norm than any policy that you could possibly ever write, because you're giving people permission to have that very uncomfortable conversation. And if you've been in a world where that is the punished norm and you're changing it, you've got to just keep doing that, reinforce it over and over and over.
Publicly praise the stuff that you want. Here's a fourth play that you can do this week. Find a leader on your team and have the commitment clarity conversation. Pick one person that's on your direct team and ask them the 3 important commitments that they're carrying right now. And then ask them to define what done looks like for each one. You're almost going to certainly find that the definitions are really vague and that the dependencies are unnamed and that the resources required are assumed rather than confirmed. That conversation is the work. And while I'm on it, let me do a 5th one. Replace the word accountability in one important meeting. In your next leadership meeting where someone uses the word accountability as some kind of cultural aspiration, replace it with reliability. Say, look, I want to make sure that we're building for reliability here. And then ask about the conditions. What conditions need to be in place for that commitment to hold? Accountability asks who's responsible. Reliability asks what needs to be true for us to get to success. Those are really different conversations.
They are. And look, the last one is the bad news. It's going to feel awkward because you are reframing a word that probably has been in your culture for years, maybe even decades. Certainly it is one that everyone feels comfortable with for the same reasons we spent the first half of the pod on. Some people are going to push back. Someone's going to say, but accountability is important. And they're totally right. But the word's not the enemy. The application of the word is. And the question is whether you're willing to have the conversation that moves the culture from blame to design. And candidly, I just don't think you can do it while continuing to call it accountability. I think it has so much baggage that's tied with it. And let's be honest, a lot of the people that listen to this, they may not feel comfortable doing it because it requires them to implicate themselves in the system that they've been running. Just like us, they probably use the word, and that's uncomfortable. But it's the only thing that actually is going to change the culture. And so you got to do it anyway. All right, senior leaders. We're at the best part of the whole show, which is when Scott talks about the things that he says. So here is your Talent Sherpa summary. Or as Scott always says, if you want stronger accountability, just post it on a banner in the break room and wait for the transformation.
I've never said that, and I never will say that, and please don't do that. Here's what I want you from today. 1, accountability is backward looking. It names what went wrong and who owns it. And that's useful, but it doesn't change the conditions that produce the miss. So if improvement is your goal, you've got to focus on reliability. Reliability is forward looking. It asks what needs to be true before a commitment is made. Number 2, high kindness cultures are the most vulnerable to reliability failure. When the relationship feels too important to risk, then nobody wants to name the broken commitment. That also paralyzes progress. Kindness without rigor creates drift, and drift looks like an accountability problem when the root cause is the absence of an honest conversation. Number 3, the 3 conditions that produce reliable organizations are commitment clarity, an early flagging norm, and a response culture that asks design questions after a miss rather than only blame questions. Number 4, and the last one, the CHRO can drive this shift. It might be uncomfortable, but you can do it. The post-mortem is a CHRO moment. The flagging norm is a CHRO moment. The commitment clarity conversation is a CHRO moment. This is not soft culture work. This is systems design, and it directly affects the execution velocity and organizational risk.
I think that's right. My takeaway from the conversation is this. And to be fair, it took me years to understand this cleanly, and I'm not sure I could have named it before I lived on both sides of it. I spent years watching organizations chase accountability and end up more frustrated, not less frustrated. And the reason is that accountability is the name we give the symptom. Reliability is the system underneath it. And if your organization keeps having accountability problems, stop adding more accountability infrastructure. That's not going to solve it. You're fixing the fever, not the disease. You got to start asking what the design failures were, because the miss was downstream of something, and you got to find that something. And that's all for today. I just want to say thank you so much for tuning into the Talent Sherpa podcast, where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. And this is so much fun to do for and with you all. And a quick shout out to one of our favorite listeners. Hello, Diana in Fairfax, Virginia. I want to say thank you for being a part of the Talent Sherpa community. And thanks to everyone who's been listening, whether that's in Escondido, California, which is a really fun city to say, and I can pronounce it, or Dublin, Ireland, which is one of my all-time favorites. Anyway, I just want to say it is so great to have all of you with us.
If you liked today's episode, do us a favor right now and subscribe to the podcast, or hit the like button, or leave us a review on your favorite platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube. It'll benefit the community if you take just a minute and leave us a review. That's what activates the algorithm and helps us to spread this content to other senior leaders. It's free to you. It'd be really helpful to us, and you might just create a benefit for somebody else.
And if you're a CHRO wondering, where do you start your AI journey? Don't forget to check out Propulsion AI. You can find them at www.getpropulsion.ai. And they are building a team of AI teammates to help human capital leaders focus on what matters to the business. Scott, what are you doing? What are you helping people with again?
I'm going to give you one word, Jackson: clarity. Our AI teammates coach managers. They work directly with their human colleagues to build clarity across a variety of talent management subjects. And don't forget, if you're an early stage CHRO and you're new to your role, Jackson has helped a lot of people who are just like you through personal coaching, or through the CHRO Ascent Academy, or through his best-selling Substack if you want to subscribe. You can find all of those if you go to www.mytalentsherpa.com.
Look, and if you're a CEO trying to figure out how to create a high-altitude human capital organization, I can help you with that as well. It's not just limited to directly with the CHROs. So thank you for that, Scott. And thanks to everyone who is listening. So until next time, keep raising the bar. Keep building the conditions before the commitment, and keep on climbing.